Donc Robert Dill, c'est un des créateurs de cette théorie de la programmation neurolinguistique qui est très largement utilisée maintenant en communication et qui a été un peu aussi, les idées de la PNL ont été un peu précurseurs de l'EMDR et sont beaucoup utilisées aussi en hypnose. Il faut savoir aussi que la PNL est assez critiquée. Il y a vraiment des publications scientifiques maintenant, mais qui sont assez contrastées, assez controversées. Donc il y a des publications qui affirment et d'autres qui infirment ces théories. Donc il y a encore du travail à faire pour essayer de comprendre la validité de ces hypothèses.
Hello, I'm Robert Diltz. I am a co-founder of Neuro-Linguistic Programming University, and I'm a trainer, author, developer in the field of neuro-linguistic programming. And I'm very happy to be presenting to you today about eye movements in NLP theories and also NLP practices. I think eye movements and the use of eye movements is one of the things that makes NLP unique as a behavioral model and a way of working with behaviors. And looking forward to sharing that. And of course, also how we connect eye movements to neurological processes, to processes that happen in the nervous system, in the brain. So I'll be, of course, sharing a little bit what is NLP for those of you that don't know much about it, how eye movements relate to that, and then how we actually apply them in various ways in NLP. And then I'll also be sharing a little bit of a research study that I did some years ago, looking at the relation between eye movements and brain activity. So I'm going to begin by going to my slides. So eye movements in neuro-linguistic programming theories. And here, of course, you see one of the most famous paintings in the world. A part of that, we see the eyes of the Mona Lisa, who's considered to have a very mysterious look. We see the eyes are looking pretty much laterally and to the left. And we'll take a look at I wonder what that mystery is. What is Mona Lisa thinking? We might not know exactly what she's thinking, but from the perspective of NLP, we can tell a lot about how she is thinking. So I'm going to begin with a little bit then about, well, so what is neuro-linguistic programming? And we define neuro-linguistic programming as the study of the structure of subjective experience. So subjective experience is what happens inside of us. And this idea of structure is how we experience that. So NLP tends to put a lot of emphasis on the process of how we do things, not as much on the contents, but on the process. And so the name neuro-linguistic programming describes this fundamental dynamics between our nervous system, we could say our mind, our intelligence, and our language, the linguistic aspect, and how the interplay between the nervous system and language affects our behavior, our actions. That's what we call our programming. Now, I'm the primary author, in fact, of Neuro-Linguistic Programming Volume 1, which was the first book on NLP, along with the NLP co-founders Richard Bandler and John Grinder, and also with Judith Delosier, who is also author with me on two other books, what we call NLP 2, the next generation, so enriching the study of the structure of experience, a subjective experience, and the Encyclopedia of Systemic NLP. And a lot of the things that I'll be presenting to you today are covered in these books. So, you know, as we look at this idea, then that, as we said, NLP is about the interplay between these three things: our nervous system, our language, and then how those affect the way that we act, that we perform in the world. So the foundation of essence of NLP is that people use their perceptual representational systems to make sense of the world. We build a map or a model of the world. That's how we navigate our way through the world. And we have essentially built those maps out of our five senses, sight, sound, hearing, feeling, both emotional, but also tactile, olfactory, smell, gustatory, taste. And one of the keys to NLP is that we would find that people tend to, for certain situations, value or put more priority on some of these senses than others. And in fact, we would say that some people are habitually more visual in the way that they learn, in the way that they interact. Others are more auditory. They're listening and speaking more than using images. Others are more feeling oriented and somatically oriented. They have to do things. Very few people we find are where their primary mode of engaging the world is either smell or taste. But these are, again, the idea here of neuro-linguistic programming is that these are the fundamental, building blocks of our realities, of our way of being in the world. And now the linguistic aspect of that, and in the early days of NLP, started because of listening to the language that people used as they described things, and beginning to wonder, if this was actually a literal description of how somebody was understanding something. So if somebody says, I see what you said, versus I get this feeling, that we started to realize, well, those are actually descriptions of what's happening subjectively, which then, of course, relates to what's going on in their nervous system. And so these are some examples of the types of language that shows these representational systems. Now, where do eye movements come in? One of the interesting things was we would be really listening to and observing people as they talked about their subjective experiences, whether they were good experiences or challenging experiences, positive things or things they considered negative. We would be listening to, well, how are they experiencing it? How are they structuring it? But we're also observing persons for other sort of nonverbal language. So language in NLP is not only, the linguistic is not only verbal, there's also the body language and nonverbal language. And one of the very interesting things we started to notice is that when people would talk about these different senses, I see this, it's not clear, or the future is bright, or I'm trying to picture something, that they would actually begin to look in specific places. And this is what led to this idea of the NLP eye movement map. So this is the foundational map of how we interpret eye movements in NLP. Now, in every culture, in every language, there are words that will represent these different senses. And we found that similar thing with eye movements. In fact, I teach all around the world. I have been teaching for many years in every continent and every country practically. And one of the things we found is, these eye movement patterns tend to be consistent. There are, of course, always places where there's different types of anomalies. But one of the interesting things that we noticed is that not only did people look for particular representational systems, but for ways of using those representational systems. So as these two diagrams are showing, one in a more schematic form and one in a more, sort of literal way, when somebody looks up, they tend to be more visualizing. When somebody's looking laterally, almost like actually towards the ears, it's listening. And here we see this one of auditory memory looks very much similar to our Mona Lisa at the beginning. And then looking down is often more feeling, although there was a special thing we noticed where there was one part of looking down, especially to the left, for a right-handed person. Now this we'll also explain that in just a moment. But when down to the left, it was more of an inner self-talk. And looking down to the right was more to access feelings. And so these are known as accessing cues in NLP, because the idea here is this is one of the ways that we get a portal, if you will, into this part of our our sensory experience. So now you'll notice, though, there's a lateral distinction here that we noticed as well, which is from the left to the right. We know that the left brain, typically in a normally organized right-handed person, the left brain tends to specialize more for language and analysis, reason, whereas the right brain tends to be more for synthetic things. When people are, wanting to be creative, they look to the right. If people are trying to analyze things or remember things, they look to the left. And so in our observations, we notice that when people look up into the right, they are visualizing, but they tend to be more accessing imagination, what we would call the sort of the right brain type of process. When people look up into the left, they are remembering things. They're trying to break things down. And similarly, we would find with the auditory system, when somebody is trying to remember something that they've heard, they'll tend to look to their left. If somebody is trying to imagine, if they're making up something, if it's like somebody wanting to compose music, you might see them looking more to their right. If somebody's, trying to figure out something to say, they might look to the right. If somebody's remembering something that we were told, they would look to the left. Now, of course, these eye positions are not fixed, meaning that we could be looking to the left and the right. There's a lot of different possibilities, which we'll be going into. But we found that when people are really wanting to bring a clearer focus and to, vivify one of these particular types of senses and sensory representations, the eyes will tend to focus for a period of time. Now, eyes, of course, if you spend any time watching people, listening to people in conversations, see that the eyes move a lot of different places. And we'll be exploring a little bit more about how NLP sees that and how we use that. Now, again, then the down position is a little different, so that the down and to the right is more just pure feeling, and down and to the left is more of the, as we were saying, this inner dialoguing. And we use a little coding system in NLP. So V means visual, A means auditory, K means kinesthetic, and then R is remembered, C is constructed. I would be an internal image, general, which could then be either a remembered or constructed, and E would mean external. So we have a kind of a whole notational system that we use, which I'll show just a moment. So these are the fundamental eye positions. Now we're gonna get a little bit more into depth with these and distinctions and how we use them. But as I said, one of the things that I found after 45 years or more than 45 years of working with these, that I find them to be really quite accurate and very helpful in being able to work with people. So what do we do with these eye movements? Well, as I said, one thing is you can use them to really vivify, or to, is again, this idea of an accessing cue, to really bring one of these particular representational processes literally into focus. In this case, it's an internal focus rather than an outer focus. Another thing we can do, of course, is we can also connect through eye movements, connect different representational processes to each other. And I'm going to show a little bit about how we do that. So one of the first things that I was involved in developing as application of NLP in education and learning was what we call the spelling strategy. Now, in the English language, because it's a primarily phonetically based language, this becomes very interesting, because the way that words sound are not necessarily always the way that they look. In other languages, this is not such a big issue. But in languages like English, where you do have silent letters and things, it can be very tricky spelling. And actually, when I was a child, I was taught to spell phonically, to sound words out, and I made certain consistent mistakes. But I knew I wasn't stupid. And in fact, I was following what the rules. But then I kind of started to realize you can't even spell phonics phonically. If you tried to spell phonics phonically, instead of Phonics, you'd spell it Fonix. And so, those would be the kind of mix-ups that we'd have. And one of the things that we often do in NLP is then we will look at, well, who is somebody that does it well? And then we map out what we call a strategy, which is a sequence of these different representational activities. So what we would find, and this is what is shown here as an example of a kind of a strategy where you see the eye movement plays a crucial role in making the whole thing work. Now in NLP, we would rarely, if ever, use eye movements simply by themselves. You're always using them in combination with other things. But here, we found that what a typically a good speller, now this again, I would say speaking in particular of the English language, you start with a relaxed feeling and don't want to be stressed. And then you're looking at the correct spelling, that's the external. Then here's where the key is, and this makes such a difference. You look up and to the left, because that's where, again, you're going to have that place of memory. It's going to enhance that visual memory. And then once you picture it, you can say or write the word. And then, so as you write it, then so I'm writing from my picture now. This is the important thing. I'm no longer looking at the correct spelling. I put that somewhere else. I'm now looking at that mental image, and I'm writing the letters of the word. And then, of course, I can compare it to what I actually did, because what I'm wanting to do is to create this inner representation of the spelling of that word, literally the visual representation. And then we would say, if it's not clear, or if I made a mistake, we can do certain things to help to bring it more. Like, here's where you can use some imagination, change colors of the letters. You can add another representational system, the kinesthetic system of tracing letters in the air. But all of these, their whole purpose is to help solidify a visual image, and the looking up and left is a key part of that. Now, I know school teachers that have said, and so many people have learned the strategy that said it's really very powerful and very important. And in fact, just this next slide just shows a couple of studies that have been done on that. This top one in blue, I think, is a very interesting one, because it's showing that it's showing the number of correct spellings, correct words out of a group of 13 words. And you'll see the beginning was the pretest. They were choosing people who were essentially about the same. You might say average spellers. They would get, roughly 10 out of the 13 words correct. And they, by the way, in this particular grouping, what they were doing was also using words that people would not have seen before, some including made up words. So that there was not a chance that somebody could have known these words before they started learning them. Now you'll see the three things, well, there's four things that they did here, actually. One was to just give no instruction at all, but to just have people do whatever they would normally do to try to learn to spell the word. One was to use the NLP spelling strategy, which is to give them the instruction to look up and to the left and visualize the word. Now, the others were very interesting to make this comparisons. The two other things they did is, one is they actually said, well, let's tell people to visualize, but look down when they visualize, which now, according to NLP, would kind of create some kind of a dissonance. I'm trying to visualize, but I'm looking to the wrong place. And then the others group was told to visualize, but not told to look anywhere. And you see this very interesting result. So one is that the people who were told to look up and visualize, they had a marked improvement. And not only that, their retention was almost perfect. People that were simply told to visualize had improvement. They weren't given the instruction to look up and left. They had improvement, not as much as those that were told to look up, but they also didn't retain as long. Interestingly, the ones who were told to look down, their initial performance went way down and then improved, which is an interesting question because on the final test, there was no instruction about where to put the eyes. So one of our guesses is that, okay, I'm told to visualize, I'm looking down, it's not so easy, but actually since I was told to visualize, probably I have some image there, and if I'm not looking down, that kind of interferes with it. I can actually, maybe do better on that post-test, the final test. And then we see that the ones that were not told to do anything at all kind of had the typical learning curve, a dropping off. So I think this gives us a really interesting insight into the role that eye movements can play in things like learning. Now, the bottom graph was a different study that was done, and this is showing errors rather than numbers right. So we see that the ones who were told to do the look up and use the NLP strategy, they had the fewest errors. They went down very few errors. They had fairly good retention. They had the best retention. Others that were given an auditory strategy, also improved, but they also dropped off, but it would not improve as much as the visual learners or the ones who were instructed to do this eye movement and the spelling strategy. And then the no treatment group basically had, as we see, has a similar, like a typical learning curve. So this is just some examples of how eye movements can be significant. Now, we use, in NLP, we use eye movements not only for these kind of learning strategies, but for other things as well. Because as we said, you can, with eye movements, I can vivify something. I can also reduce access to it by looking to another place. So in this example with spelling, if I look down, it's going to be actually harder to visualize. So now, one of the other ways that very key process for using eye movements in NLP has been what we call the visual kinesthetic disassociation. And this has been applied very effectively to treatment of trauma and post-traumatic stress. And the idea here is that you're creating what we call a disassociation from feeling, because what happens typically in these situations is a memory is connected to a feeling, and we want to be able to work with the memory without having the interference of the trauma of the feeling. And so there was a whole process that's called reconsolidation of traumatic memories that has been heavily researched in recent years. Literally have been done millions of dollars of research on this with post-traumatic stress. And you see in this picture, part of what's happening is the eye movement is key. You're looking up, and in this case, you really want to be looking not so much directly to memory, but more to this imagination. And we call it a three-place disassociation. So I'm seeing the memory in the distance, and then I'm actually, we say, floating back above myself and watching myself watch the memory. And that creates a distance from that so that the feeling is not so overwhelming. And so, but again, the positioning of the eyes is absolutely crucial for that to work. You cannot simply give that instruction. And so, as this says, it's been shown to relieve the nightmares and flashback symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and especially it's been tested a lot with people in the military, and often in less than half the time of other therapies, and in fewer than 2 or 3 sessions. And there's actually a little reference there to the website that goes over all those studies. So I think this is another really interesting, important way in which eye movements can really make a difference. In this case now, we've been mostly talking about eye positioning, which means we're emphasizing one of these sensory modalities over the other. But eye movements can also be used to create connections between different representational systems. So in some cases, I want to disconnect them. In other cases, we would say I want to sort them. In other cases, I want to consolidate them. I want to link them together. And so I developed some time ago just ways of having people practice looking to these different patterns, which, as you see, are connecting different types of sensory processes together, which can be really essential for things like learning and creativity. Actually, in the lateral movement, I was the inspiration for Francine Shapiro's EMDR process, which also helps to work with and release traumatic episodes. But I want to show another example of how I've used these patternings to help people, in this case, improve creativity. So we've looked at how we can use it in learning, how we might be able to use it in treatment of psychological issues, but also and emotional issues, but also we can use it to enhance creativity. And so the thing I'd like to share with you is one of the processes that we use for enhancing creativity, which was modeled. I was very intrigued by, I've always been intrigued by Walt Disney's incredible creative ability and spent some time studying. And here there was you see, there's a quote from somebody who said, actually, they said, this is clearly a metaphor. There were three different Walt Disneys: the dreamer, the realist, and the spoiler. I like to say more the critic. And he said, you never knew which one was coming to your meeting. And so we have this interesting thing, and Disney actually coined this term Imagineering, which is the putting together of two other words, imagination and engineering. So this becomes interesting as we are thinking, imagination is one side, engineering is another side. And again, this idea of dreamer and then going to realist. Now, you see on the slide, there's an interesting picture as well that one of the people that worked with him, one of his animators, drew of a typical pose that Disney would have during his, kind of deep creative process. And what do we see here? Key part to this pose is an eye movement, which in this case is clearly up and to the right. It's up and to his right, which is we would associate with imagination rather. Now, we also see some other things because it's almost like you can see the dreamer, the realist, and the critic all in one, because there's a bit of a critical face here. There's also he's leaning forward. Now, one of the things that I did in this process with NLP is can kind of break these things down to make them easier for people to get access to. And there's a process that I've developed that has literally been used all over the world. It's used by teams and organizations, by some of big organizations. I know this is used specifically as a process by Google and others in their product development. And so we map out these three places where eye movements then become particularly important, and especially eye position and the movement between these positions. So dreamer is the visual construction, it's imagination. So you're looking up and to the right, and you see, as I said, we rarely use the eye movement independently of other things. So we see that there's a body posture here as well. So I'm looking up and to the right. The realist is more kind of straight, or oftentimes it's sort of like looking down towards the feeling, because it's about putting things into action. And then the critic is more this down and left. It's going into this analytical place, evaluating, looking for problems and missing links. And when I work with people or I work with teams, making sure that when we are in these different processes, that we're using the appropriate physical cues, but especially the eye movement, is very significant. So this is another way that we apply this in NLP. So learning, working with, behavioral or emotional issues, creativity. Now another thing that's important is that we've been talking about looking to the left, looking to the right, and up and down. But one interesting question is, what about the center line? And what we find is then actually because people will look up and down in the center, this is what we tend to call synesthesias, which are overlappings and connections, very, very tight connections. So it's one thing to look at something and then to start planning it. It's another to be doing it simultaneously. And a lot of things happen. Obviously, we probably rarely are ever just in purely one system than another. Sometimes that's important, like in spelling. I need to be able to purely focus on just the image, or in that V-K disassociation. In other cases, we're overlapping them. Now that creates several things. One is it helps us be more efficient, but it can also create confusions. It can also create, this kind of what I call this forms a molecule of experience. And sometimes these synesthesias are what make it difficult for people to perform or function well. And so sometimes we need to break up this synesthesia. Sometimes we're trying to create the synesthesia. And so working with the center line and then these other accessing cues is another way that we apply eye movements in NLP. And I'm just going to give one example, is a process that I developed a number of years ago that's called the failure into feedback process. That what you find is that if somebody is stuck because of an experience of failure and they're afraid of failure, what you're often going to see with these kind of difficult experiences is somebody's kind of looking more down, and we even, we have these terms in our language that somebody's down today. I'm feeling down versus up. And oftentimes it's down, so I'm kind of going more into feeling. But it's not only a feeling. This is where there's also going to be some memories and other experiences. So here I'm showing in the slide the little balls represent different bits of experience. So there's maybe a memory, there's a feeling, maybe I'm saying something to myself, it's some kind of self-talk. And what we want to do to help, as we say, turn this experience of failure back into feedback is we want to deconstruct this. And we deconstruct it by actually saying, well, here if I have a feeling and a memory and saying something, let's just have the memory by itself. And so you see here, I just want to put the memory, the visual memory there, so it's just a picture. I'm going to put these words over into the left, so it's just words. And I'm going to have the feeling, just feel where it is in my body. And this does a very interesting thing. When you kind of deconstruct that molecule, it's no longer a belief or an experience. It's these different representations. And this can have a very profound effect. And eye movements, again, are a key part of this. I look to the left and see the picture. I look down to the right, I feel the feeling. And I look to the left and hear the words. And then here we realize, okay, this is only a few, and very often we find that these stuck experiences are, they're a composite of things that are not, they're not all of the possibilities. So here we see there's no imagination, there's no image of what is it that I do want. There's no other types of, imagined words. So one of the things we might do is to add to this. We're going to add in, and this is showing, this next picture is showing that we're filling in some of these gaps. Well, what is it that you do want, and how would you hear that and experience that? So now we're filling that in, and then we can reconstruct it in a different place. So, and generally what you'll see is if we ask people, think of a time when you were able to really do something well, and you were able to, use feedback effectively. And I see where their eyes go there. This is one of the things we do a lot in NLP. When we ask people questions about performance, positive or negative performance, we're looking very carefully for where the eyes go, because that's giving you a lot of information. And very often, by the way, it's things that people are not conscious of. I think, but most of us would be aware that rarely are people actually conscious of what their eye movements are doing. Partially because the eye movement itself is accompanying an inner process where they're not paying attention to the outer, they're just paying attention to the inner. So here, now we see we're using the lateral, we're using the center line, and this is where, again, eye movements can be really helpful, is in how do I synthesize something, how do I deconstruct it, how do I break it apart. And again, we can see that this has been helpful in not only for learning, for working in, like in this case, also with behavioral challenges, with stuck places, but also in being creative. Now, I gonna just end my presentation with, as I said, I've also done some looking at, since I know a bigger part of the theme is about eye movements, the conference is about eye movements and brain activity. So these, clearly these representational systems I've been talking about are mapped into the brain, primarily in the neocortex of the brain, where we have an occipital area for vision. You have the temporal areas where, sound, auditory, languages. You have the central area and the parietal area, which is where you get muscle movement and skin and senses. And then the frontal is the association area. So in this research that I did, it was way back in 1977. It was at the Langley Porter Neuropsychiatric Institute at the University of California at San Francisco. And I got a fellowship to do some studying relating these eye movements to brain activity. And so here you can see we had electrodes. We were using, this was in 77, was long before the days of personal computers. You'd be able to do a lot more now, but we had an EEG, so we could measure EEG, feed it into a computer. So the one image there is showing where we place them over the central area, the occipital, temporal. And then we were also tracking eye movements, and you can do that with electrodes. Again, I'm sure there's probably even better ways today. But so we could track, okay, when somebody looked up and to the left, what was happening. Now, if you look at this readout, so this is the kind of readout we would get. So you can see that we're tracking the eyes with the brain activity. Now here we can see that, when you go up and left, there is definitely some evoked response. There's a shift in that activity. Similarly, if you go down and to the right, down and left, that's different. It's down and to the left, you get another, in some cases, you see that the activity's actually gone in literally different directions. In going up, it's going up, going down, it goes down. Similarly, if you look down and to the right, which then is a different place, you get a different pattern. You look down look up into the left. So this is up right, down left, down right, up left. Now, one of the big challenges, of course, is although we can see that this activity is shifting, that the eye movement is accompanying some shift in activity. And usually what we were doing is we were asking people to do sensory specific tasks. Remember how many doors are on your outside of your house. That's a visual task. Or, remember the lines from a song or something. So we were giving them sensory specific tasks, and then the eyes would move in conjunction with that. Now, again, one of the big challenges that we had was that it's all relative to the baseline pattern. And actually, one of the interesting things we noticed that was part of this interpretation was that people who are tended to be more visually oriented would have a certain pattern. So if they're with their eyes open versus their eyes closed, and you would see just kind of their baseline would shift depending upon the eyes open and closed. Whereas somebody who was more hearing sensitive, you see that there's less of a shift, and it's a different pattern. These are all recordings over the same areas of the brain. So we see there is some shift when the eyes close. Somebody who's kinesthetic often, shows a different kind of a pattern. And so again, what you're looking at here, that part of the challenge in that research was, well, how do we know exactly what's happening? Has to be then a shift with respect to the baseline. Now, as I said, I'm sure there would be much more interesting ways to do that today. But I do think what this can show us, though, is that the way in which we are using our inner representational systems, there is certainly correlation between activating different senses and which parts of the brain, and then the eye movements are going to be linked in some way to that. That is not simply random. That when people are thinking and they're moving their eyes are not simply flopping around randomly in their head like tossing the dice. That there are specific purposes for those movements. So we don't have much time. I just wanted to kind of give that overview. I hope that has been of some interest to you. Now, all of these things that I've been presenting are going over in much more depth in our NLP encyclopedia, which, by the way, you can get access to that free online. So they're available at nlpuniversitypress.com. You can also find out more. Clearly, another thing you might want to do is you can learn more how to do this and how to work with these processes at our NLP University at nlpu.com. There's also some other resources there where we apply different aspects of NLP and eye movements. Journey to Genius is publishing. Tilt Strategy Group is how we use this in organizations and businesses. And then generativechange.com is where we're using this for creative purposes. So I hope that's been interesting, and just again, you can see the important role that eye movements play in many NLP processes, but also how they can be used, how eye movements can be used in things like learning, like working with personal and emotional issues, and creativity. So I hope this has been interesting. I'm sure you'll have other very interesting presentations at your conference. And maybe I hope someday to see you perhaps at our NLP University, where we have both virtual classes as well as in-person classes these days. So till then, thank you, and I will say goodbye.
Voilà, vous avez là eu un peu un overview de ce que c'est que la PNL, et vous voyez que c'est parti vraiment d'observations assez empiriques. Et en fait, tout n'est pas validé. Hein. Les mouvements des yeux qui l'indiquent sont des indications assez générales. Mais il y a quand même des études qui montrent qu'effectivement, quand on a des activités cérébrales, des activités cognitives, on oriente nos yeux. Nos yeux sont tout le temps mobiles. Il y a des données, par exemple, de l'équipe de Stanislas Dehaene qui montrent que quand on a des activités plus langagières, le regard part plus vers la droite, donc du côté contralatéral par rapport à l'hémisphère qui est le plus recruté. À l'inverse, si c'est des tâches mathématiques, on a tendance à amener notre regard plus vers la gauche. Donc il y a ces mouvements spontanés des yeux qui accompagnent nos activités mentales. Et à l'inverse, le fait d'agir sur les mouvements des yeux peut impacter nos tâches cognitives, nos tâches relationnelles, etc. Et donc c'est ce qui est utilisé par exemple en EMDR. On aura cet après-midi des présentations sur le MDR qui peut déprogrammer, reprogrammer dans le cas de stress post-traumatique, comme l'a indiqué la Roberti.